Welcome back. We are known for our beautiful beaches and blue waters. The air is warm, the breeze is light, the fish are plenty on the days that your eyes aren't tearing up and your lungs burning from red tide, which creates ugly patches of algae on the water, kills the fish, and litters the beach. Normally, when winter cools in our beloved Gulf of Mexico, we see less red tide. Not this year. How many times have we reported it seems to be clearing up? And how many times have we reported a new outbreak? And joining us for more on red tide and fishing is the resident fisherman of ABC 7 News, Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Brian Martell, captain of the Midnight Sun with Longboat Key Fishing, and New College political science professor Frank Alcock, who is an everyman. He has collaborated with Mote Marine on red tide research. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Bob, weather-wise, are we seeing something different this year that is leading, in your opinion, to the sustained outbreak of red tide?
Well, one thing I've noticed is that after the tropical season, we had that big storm go on by, and of course there was a lot of rainfall. There was some release of some of that overfill, or if you will, from St. Petersburg and Pinellas County. I did notice there was an uptick in terms of the amount of red tide, and then I don't know the correlation there. Obviously, Frank could talk a little bit about that a little later, but one thing I have noticed is that it has been moving around. It's been shifting with the tides and the currents, and at first it was very prevalent and much more so near New Pass, near Lido Beach, and now it seems to have shifted down south. And being on the front lines, you know, people are always emailing me or talking to me on social media about, you know, why don't you report more on the red tide? It's really bad today. And the interesting thing is you get reports from Longboat Key one day, and then several days later it comes from Siesta Key, or it comes up from near Anna Maria Island. And so it's been rather sporadic, and with only 2 reports coming out per week, basically, with the main report from the FWC on Fridays, there's not a lot of updated information that we can give them every day. So an everyday forecast of, for example, red tide.
Right. And Captain, do you think it's because it's been so warm this winter that our waters have not cooled down like many winters, that may have sustained the red tide?
Well, it seems that in the last 10 or 15 years at least, the red tide, when it shows up in late fall, it goes right through winter, even if we've had a cold winter. So it seems to be, you know, acclimating itself. And we've had one that a few years back that went right through a really cold winter, and then it dissipated in the spring.
But it doesn't seem like for the last 2 years we've gotten as many reports as we have this winter.
You're right. This one has been sustained. It's been sporadic. It hasn't been widespread. I know I've been fishing with Captain Johnny for many, many weeks and months, for that matter, during this red tide outbreak, and even with Captain Scott Moore up in Manatee County, up in Anna Maria. And some days it's bad. Some days there are fish that are showing up dead, and some days there aren't. And so you can move around a little bit.
Now, here's the question a lot of viewers are probably wondering right now, and it's a controversial question because we had a sewage spill up in St. Pete a couple of months ago, and there was the suspicion of many people that somehow the sewage spill is related to the red tide. I know officially we have, you know, folks have told us that's not true. But Frank, what's interesting is you wrote a research paper on red tide in Florida, and you said right in your executive summary, once a bloom moves inshore, it may benefit from land-based nutrient fluxes. The fluxes occur naturally, but they can also be exacerbated by coastal pollution.
Yeah, there's no reason that they can't. The Carenia brevis is one of the most fascinating organisms that I've ever studied or learned about. It's not a picky eater, and it could use a broad range of nutrient sources to sustain itself over a long period of time. So the scientific community researchers cannot rule out that was happening on land in terms of runoff, that a bloom can't benefit from that and actually stay a little longer or become a little bit more intense. However, what the research community does want people to know, many of the most important phases of a bloom actually occur offshore. And much of what you see on land, it actually grows really, really slowly in terms of sort of the cell replacement and the splitting, has to do with wind and water currents, which why it seems like it goes away and then it comes back. And so you're seeing snippets of a bloom's larger life cycle. And in terms of the size, you probably see a small fraction of what's happening offshore. So pinpointing and attributing what you see along the coastline and saying that's because of a specific nutrient source on land is a little misleading.
And it's not just sewage spills that we're talking about, right, Captain? Because we talked before the broadcast. You think it's the years of fertilizing and phosphate that we have.
Prior to World War II, we didn't have a lot of red tide.
What changed?
And when people started moving down and,
And
building near the water.
And taking care of their lawns.
Yes.
Yeah, I can say Captain Johnny Walker agrees with that too. He's always told me that. And Captain Scott Moore says that there's some stipulation now to use slow release fertilizers as opposed to fast release. I guess.
All of this is good. Again, anything that happens in terms of nutrient loading within our coastal, right along the coastline, can make, I think, the blooms worse. Broader patterns, though, it really is complicated. And when we come back, there's one particular mechanism.
We haven't had the rains.
Right.
And we've got the tide.
And we're going to pick up on that conversation in just a moment. We'll have more on red tide and the fishing industry coming up. But right now, we'll come back and we'll have another weather forecast. So stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are discussing red tide, which has been lingering in Suncoast waters for months now, and the way it is impacting our local fishing industry. Our guests tonight are Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Captain Brian Martell of Longbow Key Fishing, and New College Professor Frank Alcock. Captain, let me start with you. So how is this affecting your business?
Well, I fish mainly offshore, and this particular tide seems to be inshore in the bay and within 3 miles of the beach. So it really doesn't affect my business.
In terms of people who maybe take others out to go fishing, they have to go farther, and I would imagine that there is a perception issue. We keep showing the dead fish on the beach and in the water, and that must impact business in some ways.
It does in some ways, but Captain Johnny has told me, obviously, that the fish showing up on area beaches doesn't necessarily mean that's where the red tide is or was. It could have blown from some other location to there, and thus causing the dead fish. Now, another thing is, too, is that I've noticed it with fishing with Captain, we would fish places and we would expect fish, but they're not there, okay? They're not there where they had been. And certainly as you drive through the bay, you have a bait well which draws water up from the bottom of the boat, and at times you get to your other location and the bait are dead. And that's a result of the red tide maybe going over a patch, picking it up and killing the bait fish. So that's a problem too. And sometimes, if I understand this right, Captain, that some of the different kinds of fish, the species, can move away from the red tide knowing that it's around.
Your pelagic fish seem to fare pretty well during the red tide. They'll stay away from it. But your bottom fishing are really susceptible.
Well, explain to me this. We were talking before the show, you were giving me a story about flounder near a patch of red tide a couple of years ago. What did you experience, and would that flounder still be good to eat?
Yeah, what red tide does, it suffocates the fish. It prevents the gills from bringing in oxygen on the fish.
Right.
So they basically...
and so you saw this flounder close to the surface, which is not usual.
They were on the surface. They were spinning, which fish normally do during a red tide. They'll try and actually come up and try and get more air from the surface.
Yeah, and Frank, one would think, or a lot of people are home tonight and they're thinking about, okay, a fish that dies from lack of oxygen because of red tide, I don't know if I would want to eat that fish.
I wouldn't want to be picking up dead fish and eating them. But I think in terms of the safety for fish, for fin fish, which is different than shellfish, but for fin fish that have exposure, if it doesn't kill them instantly, they can accumulate biotoxins, but they'll accumulate in the guts of the fish. And so, generally speaking, if you were to catch a fish in the bay, even if there's red tide around, and it's alive when you catch it, you're pretty safe in order to fillet the fish because the biotoxins are not going to be, in the meat.
Fish is still alive, even in red tide. If he's still alive, he's good to eat.
What about shellfish?
Shellfish, the red tide accumulates in the shellfish, and it doesn't kill the shellfish, but you certainly don't want to eat it.
I understand it's clams and also oysters, and more importantly, and some of the shellfish, it doesn't have as big of an impact as what I've read.
I would just recreationally, don't, in a vicinity of a red tide, do not be eating shellfish. That could be very, very dangerous. But one of the things that it's important to say, Florida has an extremely conservative protocol in terms of shutting down commercial scalloping and commercial shellfish industry, even the slightest uptick in concentrations. And so if you're something in a supermarket, even if it's right next to an area that has red tide, it's safe to eat.
Correct me if I'm wrong, we had a situation a couple months ago where I think a local man did die from eating locally harvested shellfish that he did himself.
Yes, that's that. You'll almost every. I don't think.
Do not do that.
I don't think there's been a case of somebody shellfish poisoning with respect to red tide Karenia brevis from something they bought through commercial channels. It's all about domestic, just
But
recreational.
also, too, he probably had an existing problem.
Right, because if you have an autoimmune disease, that also is exacerbated by eating fish that's contaminated by
Every year in Sarasota, there's a few people that actually die from eating shellfish that weren't caught in this area.
Has there been any impact on local seafood restaurants and your sales to them and what's on the plate that you're going out to dinner to buy?
No, people usually ask the question, and it's taken care of. And normally this fish does not come from this area, or the shellfish doesn't come from this area. Almost any of the shellfish that are being sold in the restaurants do not come from this area.
Right. What is different now and this year as opposed to years past, and your institutional memory goes back decades?
It seems like the red tide's getting tougher.
Why?
I don't know. Could be a lot of things. It could be certainly pollution.
Pollution, and I believe you said to me that you believe a lack of precipitation and currents are affected.
This year it's a lack of precipitation. In prior years, after we've had a bad rainfall, red tide shows up.
Frank,
this year is different.
In your research paper, you do list a number of things that can possibly be done to abate this situation. Is there an answer to this? And if so, wouldn't we have found it by now?
I don't think there's no silver bullet that's going to take care of the red tide problem that's been around for millennia. This is maybe even 1 billion years old. This organism is very, very old, and there are records, historical fossil records of very nasty, bad red tides in this area even before humans were here. A range of things that we can do with respect to that'll be good, certainly for our environment in terms of reducing runoff from the terrestrial systems. I think there are things that we could do in monitoring, being very transparent in terms of information. That's what I think a lot of tourists care about. Don't lie to them. Let them know what things that they care about will be affected and what won't, getting them redirected. There are other strategies that for directly trying to kill the red tide that might work in sort of contained areas and inlets. And so there's a range of strategies, but there's no one strategy that's going to make everything better.
And Bob, you know this as well as I do. Every time that there is a situation, whether it's close to shore or in inlets, and we hear about some kind of sewage discharge, the people start calling us and they email us, and they believe 1 + 1 = 2.
Right, and that correlation seems to be there, but there's no scientific evidence of that, obviously, and until there is, you can't really say definitively that the runoff from this particular area or this sewage spill is a direct result of the increased red tide in that immediate area. So I think more research has to be done on that aspect of it. But as Frank said, the red tide doesn't develop here, it moves into here, it develops offshore. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it is well offshore, and that's where it develops and then eventually kicks onshore due to weather patterns.
And Captain, you were saying for a moment there's a particular type of fish that is closer to the shore now that was not here before, and that has affected the population or the diversity of the species that are out there right now? You were saying that they're
different kind of species that have moved in due to some reasoning.
Right.
I've noticed some people catching different kinds of fish offshore that they haven't caught in the past.
Yeah, we've got a hog snapper that we've always had them in the past, but there are more and more now.
That's good.
That's good.
They're yummy.
There's a species of fish that we are losing, and we're losing not only here, but all the way down to the Keys, and that is barracuda. The barracuda have slacked way off.
And do you relate
and
that?
And the state does not know. So far, they do not know what's going on. I mean, it's getting pretty bad.
Right. And are you in the situation that you have to go a certain distance out, not to navigate around the red tide, or?
Right now, the red tide is within 3 to 5 miles of the beach, and right now off here, it's not killing. It's not killing our bottom fish. It's not strong enough. A week from now, it could be. I mean, this thing just fades back and forth.
And that's what's interesting. I noticed this year in the weather pattern is that when the cold fronts come through, the winds and waves kick up, you're starting to see that red tide being dispersed a little bit more and become more airborne in some regards, at least the harmful impacts of it, and causing people to sneeze and notice it a little bit more. So weather plays a role in that regard too.
Let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests, plus what some of our viewers are saying about political fights on social media. Stay with us. Welcome back. It seems red tide is here to stay for the foreseeable future, but should it keep you from going out and fishing or eating locally caught seafood? Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. Bob, or Captain, I'll start with you because you're the man who has the bait in the water. How has it affected your business, and what would you say to people who are watching this right now who may be concerned about local seafood?
Well, again, as long as it's, if you can catch it on a hook and line, and it's good to go, you can eat it. As far as fishing, stay tuned to the news programs. If you're chartering a boat, the charter captains, they all know where the tide's at and where to avoid it.
And Bob, there's something that you can do, or we could all do, in terms of keeping that information out there, where the outbreaks are and where they're not.
I know some of the viewers sometimes think it's a conspiracy that I don't report on the red tide. You know, it's out there. Why don't you say anything? Someone's tying your hands.
I got that call last week.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. No, I think people have to become more proactive when it comes to reporting the red tide, and you can do that through the myfwc.com site. So if you see fish kills or you have some irritation, you can just file the report, and that will give everyone a little bit more information, and information is crucial in determining, you know, how big and bad the red tide is and when it goes away. And that's another interesting thing. I think more science needs to be done in terms of why does it go away all of a sudden? Where does it go? How does it happen? If we can figure that out, maybe we can move it along.
And that leads us to an incredible report that I just read, an assessment of Florida red tide causes, consequences, and management strategies. And it just so happens we have the author right here.
How about that? Pretty good report.
I mean, you do basically lay out where we are. And
where we were in 2007, so it's a decade old already. So.
Right, but there are lessons to be learned from this report in terms of what's causing this and what the implications are.
Yeah, and in summary, I just said this is a fascinating critter. There's more to it than meets the eye. The more that you know about it, I think the more questions that are raised. It is an incredibly resilient, persistent organism that a variety of factors come together that cause blooms. They've been happening for a long period of time. They're changing over time. Learn, more research.
Thanks, gentlemen. But before we go, we want to share with you what some of our viewers are saying about last night's topic, online political fights. Suncoast psychologists say that they have had more patients complaining about stress from politics. Pew reports 1/4 of social media users have even adjusted their settings to avoid political posts. And so we asked you what you think. And Mike Barbario writes, I have watched people I considered friends, normal and kind people, turn into raving lunatics. Liberals seem to have lost their minds. I find it all disheartening, and I honestly pity these people who once were sane human beings. It all makes me sad. Tyler Petz writes, article about stressful political discourse, top comment says it's all liberals. If you don't think that it's both sides, if you don't ever disagree with the tone of people that are on your side, then you're probably part of the problem. Ha! And Jan Vestal writes, what do I think about the political discourse online? I love it. I think when you have true discourse, it is interesting and enlightening. What I don't like are people who have zero respect for the thoughts or opinions of others and stoop to immature name-calling and ridiculous mimes to make their points. What do you think about red tide, and will it keep you from fishing and enjoying our local seafood? Just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/news@7. And FYI, want to watch past Roundtable discussions? They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. Thanks to our guests for being here tonight. Bob Harrigan is Chief Meteorologist for ABC 7 News, and our resident fisherman, Brian Martell, is the captain of the Midnight Sun and runs Longboat Key Fishing, and Frank Alcock is a professor of political science at New College of Florida who has done research with Mote Marine on red tide.